A lot of people, more than we normally have in here during a day. I won't say very much because you're not here to listen to me. I'm sure you are here to listen to Dr. Gürkaynak tell us about his and his colleague Dr. Refet Gürkaynak's thoughts about the Turkish economy during the rule of the AKP, the AK party. Very glad that we have so many people here to listen to what I'm sure is going to be a very interesting and exciting talk. I hope we will have some time at the end for questions, and I'm sure Dr. Gürkaynak will be willing to take them and to answer whatever you have to say. We will hope to finish by 1:30, so if you have a lesson at 1:40 and we're still speaking, then you can obviously try to leave as quietly as possible. I would also request that you switch off your telephones or switch them to silent mode so that we don't interrupt the speech and the speaker during the following 50 minutes. Okay, Refet, thank you very much.
Great. All right, so you see the wonders of a sexy title for a talk. And this is joint work with Selin Sayekböke, and she prepared the title page. This is a talk based on a short paper the two of us wrote this weekend in Turkish for Bilkent. That's a Turkish journal that we are kind of fond of. And this is a title from that journal that I'm particularly fond of. İnşaat Ya Resulullah is Tanıl Boraz Genius. Was on the construction boom in Turkey. So, and the reason why David wanted me to talk on this topic in particular is that it is important. We care. And we realize how much we care when we looked at this. This is a graph showing the growth rates of the Turkish economy, growth rates of output, growth rates of income. These are the same thing, right? And these are the growth rates, and these are the vote shares of AKP in various elections. All right. So, it's not a coincidence that at times when things were going so well, these guys got so much more of the vote. And in fact, although many of us perceive this linear increase in AKP's vote share, that was not actually the case. In the 2009 elections, their vote share actually went down quite a bit. Okay? And again, it's not a coincidence that this is the crisis year. It's not a coincidence that this happened during a time when the Turkish economy had contracted by about 14% in the first half of the year, and that's around when the election was. Hence, we are aware, and more importantly, AKP is aware that their political fortunes is deeply tied to the economic fortunes of this country. In fact, after the 2007 elections, when it was very much expected that AKP would win the election, but they won in a landslide, and it was kind of a surprise. There was a survey right after the election. That's important. After the election, and I asked, who did you vote for, and why did you vote for those guys, right? Among the AKP electorate, among the people who voted for the government, 85% said they voted for economic reasons. Okay, so that's really an important statistic that tells you that it isn't that we like you guys, blah blah blah, right? I feel how much better my life is. That's why. Okay, and in fact, if I don't feel that, you don't get the votes. Now, the opposition, not quite consciously comprehending this, but kind of understanding this is important, also makes sounds about this. But you aren't surprised whenever someone from the government is talking about, they begin to talk about something like, compared to 1855, our GDP is so much higher, blah, blah. And then the opposition is, no, it's all terrible crap, right? So this study was an aim, or our aim in this study was mostly for our benefit, trying to understand, what really was going on. How should we be thinking about this, right? And the big thing that we learned is this. There isn't a single the economic performance under the AKP rule. It isn't that, every day was different either, right? It isn't that we can't know. There are actually two very clear sub-periods of economic performance when AKP was the government. The two periods, again, not coincidentally, coincide with the existence of the IMF program that the previous government had gotten into, okay? And the period when that program was no longer binding and in fact was no longer around, so AKP was doing economic policy the way it saw fit. Okay, and this is the natural breaking point. Now, very soon I will talk about that IMF program, but one important thing about this is that program began in 2001, ended in 2008. It turns out, when you look at what was going on in the program, like Selin Hoca and I did, right, you realize that the program was actually mandating strong policies, was drawing a strong policy framework only until 2006. Beginning in 2007, although on paper the program was still there, it wasn't mandating certain policies to be done. Okay? So 2007, 2008, in theory we were under a IMF program, but in practice it wasn't providing policy guidance for us. All right. Now, when you look at that, when you look at the, what was happening in the Turkish economy, right? We think of this 1990 to 2001 as the lost decades of Turkey, or lost decade of Turkey. Right? And in fact, it's a terrible time. Partly because we include 2001 in here as well. Right? 2001 was a huge contraction. If I omitted that, it would be slightly better, but not much better. 1990s were indeed a terrible decade. Most people in this room don't remember that. Lucky you. Right? Because it was, a crisis, and then a mad boom after a crisis, and then the boom leading to a crash and another crisis, right? Like every other year. It was terrible. We grew 3.5%. This is the real growth. This is not inflation and whatnot. It's actually Turkish output grew 3.4% per year during that period. But now if you tell this to someone from Japan, they're going to say, oh, that's great. Right? For a country like Turkey, we should be growing much faster. In fact, the normal growth rate of Turkey, the historical annual growth rate of Turkey is 4.5%. And that 4.5% turns out to be quite a magical number. Pick almost any consecutive 10 years in Turkish history and ask, what was the growth rate? Beginning in the 1950s or so, the answer is about 4.5%. Okay? In 2002, 2006, we grew 7.2%. Now, that's growth, right? That really kicked ass. So that's the good growth performance and great things happening period. All right? We're still talking about this. In 2007, 2012, our growth rate is below our historical average, and in fact, isn't any different from the terrible lost decade either. Okay, so that's the clear break that that makes you say you really cannot talk about the Turkish economy under the AKP rule. Okay, there are blatantly clear two different sub-periods, one in which good things were happening, the other in which they apparently weren't. So what was going on? Before going into what was going on, it's good to put these in perspective because I'm a closed economy monetary economist, so I don't know these things anyway, but she does. She's an international economist. So she told me that we aren't alone. Now, this is something you wouldn't know because you read Turkish newspapers. And Turkish newspapers never report on what happens in the rest of the world unless we are directly affected. Hence, you wouldn't know that most of emerging markets had a growth performance like this in the 1990s. If you ask any of your Latin American friends, they're going to tell, yeah, 90s were a terrible time. We had crisis after crisis after crisis. And then they're going to say, but then we got our act together, right? We got the budget in balance. We had an independent central bank. We began to the inflation target. And you're going to sounds like Turkey, right? Then good things happened. Let's see. When you look at our peer countries, developing emerging countries, right? 1990, 2001, yeah. Life sucked for them too. 2002, 2006, things were much better. Close to us, right? 2007 to 2012, they continued to be much better, unlike us. All right? So that's really important, right? So part of this tells us that, something happened in the world, and that's not the topic of this talk, right? why is it that suddenly the whole world got this enlightenment and began to do better policies and had a faster growth path, blah, blah, blah. But in 2007, 2008, I remember being on a TV program with Selin Hoca. I've been on a TV program, I think, twice in my life. How many times have you been? More than twice. It must be the blonde thing. She gets invited all the time. But she said, it could be that, so she said, we're going to learn whether our growth performance after the crisis was a one-time, happy accident, or whether this is the new normal, okay? That says that's not the new normal. That's the sad thing. The political talk from the government is, oh, it's the new normal, that's still going on. No, it isn't. The political talk from the opposition is, it never was there. Well, it was there. Right? So, one useful thing about Turkey, or one useful thing to know about Turkey is, although we are, strategically located at the southeast corner of Europe, we are by all means a Latin American country. And this is seriously true. I mean, I can make an extremely strong case for this in terms of economics, which I know, not as much as her, but something about. But politically and sociologically, that's more or less correct too, right? And when you look at this, you understand that yes, the growth understanding, the policy understanding of emerging markets changed as a whole. We were no exception, right? And then we became the exception by not following up on that. So what was happening in this good period? The IMF program, right? Now this government got extremely lucky in 2002 because in 2001 we had a horrible crisis. Many of you don't remember. Again, lucky you. It really hurt. And then we said, okay, finally this time we're going to get our acts together, right? Because in 1990s we kept on having exactly the same crisis over and over and over again. It really fit into Albert Einstein's lunacy description, right? Doing the same thing under the same circumstances, expecting a different outcome. We kept on doing exactly the same thing. In fact, what was going on was the Turkish government was unable and unwilling to collect taxes, but really wanted to spend. That led to huge budget deficit. It had to be financed somehow. The government borrowed like crazy. Okay? Like crazy means, for example, there were times when on top of the tax revenues, the government borrowed 16% of total output in this country to make its ends meet. Okay? Those are insane numbers. It's no wonder that your banking system was shambles because the banking system was only doing this. Lend me, and I'll lend to the government. You couldn't go to a bank and borrow anything because, you would have to compete with the government. You could not do that, right? But the government was a mess. By implication, the banks were a mess. The banking system as a whole was a mess. We knew this, but we weren't touching it. Right? There's nice language for this. This is Japanese banking system language. It's called zombie banks. They are dead, you know them, but they are still walking around. We refuse to believe that they are dead. Okay? And then the central bank was a subdivision of the treasury because you can't do independent monetary policy if all you worry about is, will I be able to borrow today? Will I be able to borrow today? Okay? So that was terrible. We had the crisis, and then we said, okay, we're going to fix this. This time, actually, we're going to fix this. And surprisingly, we did. Right? So what happened? We took budgetary measures so that the budget deficit shrank a lot. Right? We gave 20% of national income, 1 in 5 liras of production, we gave as a gift to our banking system so that the banking system was recapitalized. Those dead banks, they actually became alive. Okay? The government took over the bank's losses and gave them output instead, right? You gave them output instead. That really, really, really hurt, right? Because you're having a crisis. Your output is shrinking already, right? And then you're paying back all debts, and then you're recapitalizing your banking system. Who was doing this? This is the coalition government in 2003, 2001, right? You can only imagine how costly this is in terms of economics, in terms of politics, in terms of daily life, right? It sucked. But we did it. And then, Devlet Bahçeli, in his infinite wisdom, called for early elections. Right at the time, all of the costs of the stabilization program were paid, and we were going to reap benefits. So, he deserves a special praise for the political and economic landscape today, right? Not surprisingly, the electorates who had only seen a huge crisis and an extremely painful adjustment, but not the benefits of the adjustment yet, right, left all three coalition partners outside the parliament. AKP found itself as a single-party government for the first time in many, many, many years, with a majority not even they themselves envisioned, right? Now, the key economic decision the party made was at that time. Every single Turkish government in the Republican history, when they inherited the government from the previous party, first said, we inherited a ruin, enkaz devraldık. This is standard Turkish lingo, right? And then said, that ruin is because of the previous government's policies, we're going to change them altogether. And so this government could have done that too. The ruin is because of the IMF program, and we're going to just change it altogether. They did not. Not only did they did not do this, they actually went out and said, we are not going to change the program. That's a good program. It's going to bring benefits. And we announced that we're going to keep following that program to the letter. And they did. Now, that's where they really deserve accolades, right? Because it's partly because they did not have any alternatives, right? They did not have the know-how to come up with an alternative economic program. They did not have the economically trained people in the upper echelons of the party, whatnot. But this is mostly really because they got the picture, right? They understood. You know what? Really, this program is working. And those idiots, they paid the cost. By not changing anything, we're going to reap huge benefits. That's your benefit. All right? Now, that program I'm very fond of that program. And you won't find many Turkish leftists, I consider myself a leftist, who are fond of any IMF anything. But, I'm an economist. I understand what is going on in that program. And that was a really well-thought program. When you looked at what was trying to be accomplished through which means, you could say, even before anything was done, if this is actually done, it will work. That's different from the 18 previous IMF programs, when even at the time of the inception, you looked at the program and said, The local bit is important. So there's some grand design elements of this program, right? It's things like, we're going to do inflation targeting, we're going to have floating exchange rates, things like that, right? But then there are all these local steps. The government will have to do this by that date. We'll have to provide us this by that date. We'll have to pass that law by this date. All of those things were through the Turkish bureaucracy. And in fact, the Turkish bureaucracy, this is not unique to us, but our bureaucrats, having had a zillion IMF programs, are particularly adept in this. The bureaucrats know what should be done anyway. They also know that the politicians will not do it if they say so. So they use the IMF to force the politicians to do what should be done anyway, right? The 2001 program was great in that regard. So it had a checklist. And that's what really the program is. The checklist said, by this date, you pass this law, right? What is the law? Public procurement law, kamu ihale kanunu, right? By this date, you privatize this. By this date, you make sure that your deficit shrunk to this level. By that date, you pass this other law, Social Security law, Sosyal Güvenlik Kanunu. These are really big things, okay? That list essentially expired in 2006. When you look at the entries in 2007, 2008, it's mostly things like, we won't be bad boys, right? So program literally ended in 2008. So the rate ended in 2008, but de facto it ended in 2006. Good. So then the question is, the program actually gave us a policy framework, right? You do this. In fact, as a Turkish citizen or a foreigner, in 2005, when you asked what will happen in this country, you know exactly what would happen. That was the checklist. It said, by March 2006, this will happen, right? Now, that's great. That really gives you a... you may not like everything, but at least you know what will happen, right? That limits uncertainty about policy very much, and that's something really important, okay? Especially in a country like Turkey, right? Then you ask, okay, so what have we been doing since 2007? And the answer is nothing, all right? Now, what is the policy framework? And really, there is no policy framework. One thing that the AKP government really understood strongly is fiscal balance matters. Fiscal balance matters, and confidence about fiscal balance matters. So they keep on talking about this, and I think good for them. This is correct. Okay? But the program actually gave you, solid steps about how fiscal balance is to be achieved. Now what we hear is we keep on caring about the fiscal balance. That's really not good enough. Right? So now we have these medium-term programs, Orta Vadeli program, right? And those things are not checklists. Those are wish lists. They say things like, sustainable growth will be accomplished. Okay. Godspeed. Right? But understand the difference between this kind of a program and that kind of a program, right? One is actually a task list. It's a promise for something that I can monitor, right? You told me you would do this, and I'm looking at you, and I don't see you doing that, right? But if you say these vague, wouldn't it be nice kind of things, you can't be blamed for not doing those either, okay? During that time, there was a debate about a fiscal rule. A fiscal rule is literally a law that says the government spending can only be so much of tax revenues or GDP or past GDP something. But you put a legal cap on what the government can do, okay? You understand why we were talking about this. This was Ali Babacan's idea, and he's a smart economist. He understood that the IMF program provided a policy benchmark. With the end of the program, that benchmark was gone, and we needed something new to replace that, right? So he proposed a fiscal rule. What happened? We kind of talked and whined about it for a couple of years, and then the prime minister said no. Right? So we are now very much used to seeing the prime minister saying no to his own members of cabinet, but that was an early example. And that was an example where the government clearly understood that that rule would have worked, that they wouldn't be able to spend, and they would like to keep the option of spending. Okay? But then when you ask, so what are we doing now, right? What is the plan? What should you expect of fiscal policy? I don't know. Neither do you, neither does anyone. So that's a big problem. The program had three things, right? One is that the budget will have to be reformed. This is of primary importance. You can't do anything else if this is not fixed, right? If your government has to borrow like crazy, regardless of what else you're doing right, you're going to break the economy, okay? So this gets fixed. Then, if your banking system is a mess, you really can't do monetary policy. Monetary policy works through the financial system. If your financial system is bankrupt as a whole, do as much monetary policy you want, right? It's going to get killed in the banking system. So you have to fix this. You have to fix them in terms of their capital, that is, make them alive again, and then make sure that they don't kill themselves again, right? That's the supervision. BDDK, the Turkish bank supervisor, is, I think, one of the best in the world. They really know what they're doing in terms of micro bank management. That is, when they go to a bank and look at their books, the rules are very good. I'm very fond of the way they think of the regulatory design, and the implementation is very tough. Okay? So that's very good. The last bit is, if your government no longer needs you to finance the deficit, and there is a banking system that functions, you could now do monetary policy. So let's have a central bank that actually does monetary policy. Then you ask, what duty do I want that central bank to have, right? The good answer, the modern answer to that question is, we want the central bank to control inflation, right? This is one target. That's what inflation targeting is, right? I'm going to give you one duty and one tool to accomplish that task. You get to control the short interest rate, and with that, with one arrow, you get to hit that one target. Is that doable? It should be, okay? Not every day, but on average, you should get this right. This is a good policy framework, all right? So, but these, and many other things too, things like the public procurement law and things like that, those are very important institutional reforms, right? And Bilin Hoca is the grandmaster of those things, so she would tell you more about the institutional design here and why it's so important. But the changes were in terms of the practice of economic policy and in terms of the design of economic policy and the institutional setup that led to that design and that implementation. Right? So this is important. So when these guys say we did great things, they actually did great things. Okay? The way to see that is the following. There was an international financial crisis in 2008, right? Banks failed left and right in US, in England, in Netherlands, in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, all over the place. Now, those of you of sufficient seniority, think of the following. In 2003, somebody tells you that, yeah, in 5 years' time, there's going to be a global financial crisis. Banks will be failing all over the place. But not only will no Turkish banks fail, there won't even be pressure on Turkish banks. People will actually know that the banks will not fail. We would have thought the guy is completely crazy. Right? Because our own history was that, you know what? If bad things happen in the rest of the world, terrible things happen in Turkey. But we actually don't need terrible things happening in the rest of the world. We create terrible things of our own anyway, right? So this is actually amazing, right? It's a huge accomplishment. Understand this, right? You open the newspaper, on the front page it says, Fortis failed. It actually failed, right? The parent Fortis failed. There is a bank called Fortis in Turkey that is owned by Fortis. You would expect people to run to that bank to get their money out. Our bank regulator was good enough that they persuaded people that although the name is the same and it is actually owned by the failed Fortis, this is a separate entity that is regulated by our regulator and is safe. And it worked. Holy crap. Right? This is not the kind of economic performance we expected of ourselves. Right? It's for the grown-ups to do. So that was awesome. And this is the part where, unless you begin by acknowledging this, the fact that the AKP rule actually delivered some goods, did some things right, you really should not be taken very seriously for the rest of what you have to say. A corollary of this good policy early on was the budget was in very good shape, right? Our deficit was low and our debt was low. So we could borrow, we could spend. When the crisis hit, the government said, you know what? The crisis hit, demand is too low, so we're going to increase our spending ourselves. Yeah? So that's this. Don't worry about the dotted line now. The solid line is Turkish GDP. That is the Turkish production, Turkish income. Okay? This is the 2009 crisis. Notice that this actually is a worse crisis than the 2001 crisis. Okay? But we think of 2001 as the terrible times, and this as a, passing period. It was not a tangent. It actually did hurt a lot, right? One has to be serious when looking at the graph, right? I mean, this hurts like crazy, but it was really not as bad as 2001. Why? Banks didn't fail. The country as a whole didn't go down the drain, right? And we could do counter-cyclical policies. This is a nice phrase. Counter-cyclical means when the business cycle goes badly, that is, bad things happen, you want your government to increase spending, right? I don't want to buy, you don't want to buy, you don't want to buy, well, someone should want to buy, okay? That's a very good role for the government at a time like this. What was our government doing at this time? I really don't want to buy. Why? I have to balance my budget, okay? By this time, we had balanced the budget. Hence, we could do these good economic policies, okay? So what happened? So I apologize for the Turkish chart here. This is for a different paper I wrote with a graduate student. But this thick, solid line here is the Turkish government spending, excluding interest spending as a percentage of GDP. What you see here is between 2008 and 2009, there's this huge jump. The government begins to spend a lot more. Is that good? That's very good, right? That's exactly the kind of crisis response you want. But then it never comes back down. Okay? Is that good? Well, here your economy was shrinking 14%. Here your economy was growing 10%. Do you really think that the same economic policy is good policy? Right? But spending is nice. It feels good. All right? So this is where we begin to think about the second half of the AKP government. And the key phrase here is going to be potential. So allow me to slide back into my role as an economics professor for a second and define potential GDP. This is one of the most abstract concepts in macroeconomics, and I think one of the most useful. It's beautiful. It is the answer to the question, if left alone, how much do you expect this economy to produce normally anyway, right? So when you say Turkey is producing too little, are you saying that, given what we should be able to produce today, given our means, we're producing too little, we are below our norm anyway? Or are you saying our normal is too little? Those are two different things, okay? So potential lets you define what normal is, that. And it depends on your factors of production. And we're going to talk about these in a second. And here's the second. So how much labor you have, right? How many people are willing to work? How much capital you have, right? What machines do they use to produce? How trained this labor is. This is something really important, right? It may be formal education, it may be on-the-job training, but it's the abilities of your labor force. And then there's technology, which we don't know what it is, but it has to be there because these don't explain everything. So now, Selin Hoca used some advanced statistical techniques to estimate the Turkish potential. I'm not quite sure where this comes from, but it looks like potential lines estimated by the central bank and other smart people too, so she must be right. Even if it didn't, I would have assumed she is right. But this is your potential. So more seriously, this is actually a moving trend line, and it kind of captures potential. And what this says is, look, no wonder 2001 sucked. No wonder 2009 sucked, right? You fell so much below potential that people who wanted to work were there. Machines that could have produced were there. You weren't even using those, right? That's really terrible, okay? But the problem here is, okay, so when you're here, economic policy is more or less straightforward because you're saying the productive capacity is there. I just want to push actual production towards the capacity, right? That's good policy. How do I do that? How do I tell people you could produce, right? You're there, you're idle, work, right? You have to create demand. That's where expansionary policies actually work, right? Here, during this period. Does it surprise you that we grew like crazy between here and here? No, there is all this idle productive capacity. You just pick up slack and you grow, right? So a lot of our growth in the early period is actually coming from picking up this slack towards the potential. Here too, right? We grew 10% in 2010 and then like 8% in 2011, right? So that's right. Those are like huge growth rates. Why is that? Well, because you grew like minus 5% here. Okay? You have to pick it up. You have to get to your normal. So is it surprising that we grew like 8%, 10% here? No, it's not. Right? The question is, once we get here, can we continue to grow at those rates? Will the same policies help again? Right? So that's the key question. When are we trying to do policies to pick up slack? When are we saying the productive capacity is there, we just need to utilize it? And when are we saying we have to increase the productive capacity? Well, in Turkey, we never have this conversation. Right? So a lot of this 2002, 2006 growth, and literally all of 2010, 2011 growth, were convergence towards the potential. That's not too hard. And let me not trivialize this. We had many episodes in the past where we couldn't even do that. Right? So it's good that this was done. But it's a different ball game from growth in the potential. Right? Those were growths put towards the potential, picking up slack, not growth of the potential, which is what we need now. How is that going to happen? Right? So this is the key thing. We have this new, rote learning economic policy mindset. Expansionary fiscal policy, low interest rates. These are good, these deliver growth. Of course they deliver growth when you have this huge slack. But then you have to ask, these are all mechanisms for pushing demand, right? Low interest rates, it tells you buy more, right? Government itself, government spending, the government is saying, I am buying more. These are higher demand. How are we going to end up with higher production as a result of this if our productive capacity has not changed? The answer is, we can't. Hence, we buy from the rest of the world, right? The government tells us, you really want to buy, right? I look at the interest rates I face and I say, I really want to buy. And the government says, I really want to buy. Okay, we all want to buy. Who's going to produce? Well, we get to produce this much. The government is telling us, buy more. We can't produce more than this, okay? where is this extra demand going to be satisfied from? Well, it's good that we have Germany. Okay? That's the definition of the current account deficit. Cari açık dediğiniz şey budur. Okay? So the government, on the one hand, is complaining about the current account deficit, but on the other hand, with many, many hands, is pushing demand to create that current account deficit. Now, it's important to understand that these cyclical policies, fiscal spending, the government saying, I'm going to buy stuff, right? Central bank saying, I'm going to lower interest rates. These are cyclical policies. These are policies appropriate to move actual production around the potential, right? There are other policies, okay, that we need for growth. These policies no longer help. We are no longer in 2001 or 2009, right? And very few people, other than the blonde woman there, has realized this. Now, so these policies haven't been helping. The bad thing about this was we would have realized this by 2008, 2009 or so. But because of the international crisis, the whole world was in this upheaval. So the cyclical movement actually kind of screened the secular, deep, fundamental problems from our view. Okay? So now we're thinking about these things. So that's the important bit, right? The government in particular, but we as a whole are still talking as if we're living in the 2002, 2006 Turkey. We aren't. It's a different world. Now, so what we need? This is something you hear all the time. You probably don't know what it means. Yapısal dönüşüm, yapısal reform, right? Structural reform. Structural reform is, look, if we're going to produce more people should be working. You don't need to be a genius to see that, right? If we eat everything we produce, we don't add to the capital stock, right? We have to save more. What else? So the average educational attainment, number of years the average Turkish worker has been to school is 6.5. Okay? That tells you a lot about the Turkish economy, right? With that much training, it's a surprise that we get to produce this much, right? So now you ask yourself, okay, are we doing policies that are going to foster these? And my answer is, well, her answer is, the government gets upset when you say things like that. So I actually think we are doing just the right policies, but she makes me say that all these things about women should have at least 3 children, right? That really doesn't help here. The Turkish female labor force participation, the percentage of women above the age of 15 who could be working, who are either actually working or looking for a job, are interested in working, are 30%. Okay? That's a shame. These policies would make it lower, not higher. Okay? We should be saving more and adding to our capital stock. The real interest rates in Turkey, which I will not define now, are negative. That is, if you have half a brain, you understand that if you save today, actually you would be worse off in a year's time. It's better to spend. Okay? That's your central bank. This is the one that you do know, right? There was a time when we complained that all Turkish students are able to do are memorize stuff. I am sad to report that not even that is there now. Right? So the Turkish education system has completely imploded. Now, do we expect faster growth rates? But we want faster growth rates because figure 1 told us that we don't win elections unless we grow fast. So what do? Well, apparently what we do now is you say, these policies worked in the past, right? Once I was sick, I took this medicine, it worked. I'm sick today too, I'm going to take this medicine. It's not the same sickness. Minor differences, right? So we're going to increase spending, we're going to decrease interest rates, and then see what happens. Well, what happens is you have a historically high current account deficit, right? This is true. It is indeed by far the largest current account deficits in the history of this country. We are borrowing like gangbusters. And in fact, the foreigners are aware. They aren't lending to us the way they used to in the past. So the international grandmaster of this foreigners and what do they think and what do they do is sitting there. And she told me that, look, there is a good kind of borrowing when foreigners come and buy your factories, for example, and operate them better, teach you something, right? Okay, good. Or at least lend you for long periods of time, right? So I'm lending to you and you don't have to pay back until 5 years from now. Okay? The dark bar shows you our foreign borrowing that's in those forms. Foreign direct investment and long-term borrowing. The light bar shows the short-term borrowing. This is what is called hot money. Sıcak para denen şey bu. Right? So your foreigners say, yeah, I see that you really want to borrow from me so that you can buy my goods. Right? And I'm willing to lend to you, but I will only lend to you in a maturity of a month. After a month, you have to borrow again. After a month, you have to borrow again. That's not much fun. Right? That's this. Okay? This is the foreigner's way of saying, you don't look much like the 2005, 2004, 2006 Turkey. And in fact, the world is different too. So how about this? I'm willing to pay for your current account deficit for your great consumption appetite. But, I don't trust you enough to lend you for years and years and years of time. So I want to keep you on the hook to make sure that if I want my money back, I could get it immediately. That's not the kind of borrowing you really want to see. Okay, so that has not really turned out well. So what has happened? We don't have the productive potential, but we are using economic policy to stimulate demand. Well, A, the same amount of goods and services, and then you're being told by various means, eat more, eat more, eat more. If we all want to eat more, the prices of these things go up, right? That's called inflation. So is it a surprise that we haven't been hitting the inflation target in I don't know how many years now, 4 years? Right? No surprise. Everybody wants to borrow. Now this is good in some sense because the government doesn't want to borrow, so other people can, right? But then when you look at the total bank lending, it's going up like crazy. Right? So then you ask, is it really the case that the Turkish firms and households think that, oh yes, tomorrow will be so much better than today that if I borrow like crazy today and pay it back tomorrow, I will say, yeah, I'm so glad I borrowed yesterday. Or is it that this is a country that never actually had a functioning banking system? You never actually could borrow from banks. You have no history of learning from borrowing and paying back and whatnot. And then suddenly your banks are saying, oh, now that the government doesn't want these funds, how about you guys? Okay? Short-term currency flows, I showed you this earlier, right? You get these huge currency flows. These policies kind of worked, right? One of the things that really fostered this is the construction boom, which I think is terrible in many, many ways, right? So you create this demand, it has to go somewhere. One place that it goes like crazy is construction. Construction is bad for the following reason. I'm almost done. Construction is bad for the following reason. The kind of construction we do is not productive construction. Right, building a residence, building a shopping mall, it's not building in the sense that, tomorrow this is going to produce a lot of stuff that you will want to buy, okay? But what is happening is, I think this is a particularly good example, think of Zorlu, right? 5 years ago, when you thought of Zorlu, you thought of Vestel. Today, you're thinking about Zorlu Center in Istanbul. Every single large Turkish conglomerate is turning into construction. Why is that? Because the returns there are insanely high. You buy this land, you go to the government says, oh yes, this was zoned for 2 stories, but how about 200 for you, right? Take a walk in Ankara. No?
You can't walk in Ankara.
Very good point, right? This is particularly striking. 60% of the cabinet's decisions in the first half of this year were about construction or rezoning. İmarla ilgili kararlar. %60'ı Bakanlar Kurulu kararlarının. Right? Now, this is going up like crazy. And then at some point you have to ask, who's going to buy all these? No? But this works in many, many ways, right? It produces economic rents. Bu kira değil burada bahsettiğim şey, rant hakikaten. Right? It produces economic rents because you have this plot of land, right? You could only build 2 stories on this, and I change it, and you say, oh, 20. Suddenly I created this value out of nowhere. Okay? I can reward whoever I want to reward, make you feel really good about yourself, and me as the government. Okay? So it used to be that we did this with borrowing. Right? In the 1990s, it was the government wouldn't collect taxes, but would rather borrow from you, pay you a high interest, made you feel good about yourself. Now the same thing is happening by changing the zoning laws and making you feel good about yourself because suddenly I'm such a genius, right? This building is worth so much more. No, it's just that you shouldn't have been able to build it there anyway. Okay? That. So there's a reason why the flyer for this talk had this picture in, right? This is the summary statistic of Turkey in 2013. We're building many of these. It would be great if they would invite someone from the fine arts to talk about the aesthetics and the city planning aspects of this. We all suffer through it, but the economic suffering is no less. It's just that we haven't been faced with the bill yet. So blah, blah, blah, blah, right? This works. One of the reasons why this works is we are able to borrow. Why are we able to borrow? The rest of the world is doing so terrible that all of the central banks around the world are saying, you know what, if you want to borrow, we're happy to lend you at 0 interest, right? And then Turkey says, and then we're going to pay 6% interest. 0, 6, good deal. I'm going to borrow here, lend here, okay? But that is not going to last forever. This is the tapering talk, right? The rest of the world is going to do better. The central banks will not offer this free money. We will still be the same Turkey. What will happen then? That's a good question to think, okay? So the summary before the conclusions is this party understands full well that they need high growth to sustain their power, right? This was doable by demand management policies, by fiscal policy, simple monetary policy. No longer that is the case. So you have to do painful reforms. Painful reforms are education reforms, right? You know, invariably you make a lot of people unhappy about that. Painful reforms are things that induce people to save. People are happier when they consume, actually, right? So if you induce people to save, they don't feel like, oh yes, you know, I have this nest egg. They feel like I used to go to, you know, do this, eat that yesterday. I can do this today. Okay, those are painful. So rather than do that, they push demand. Doesn't work. The economy isn't built to sustain that kind of demand. We see this high temperature all over the place, mostly in the current account deficit, right? That will not go on. So what happened? The AKP government should be thought of under 2 sub-periods, right? They delivered great economic outcomes, and this is fact. You know, this is a factual fact. They did deliver great economic outcomes in the first period of their administration, right? It was a very prudent, brilliant, and I think important in many ways decision to stick to the IMF program, which they did, all right? And they deserve praise for this. I do praise them for that. That's really important. But then, once the program was over, they began to think that it wasn't the program, it was them. That by their very nature, they delivered these great outcomes. You know, I mean, there are valuable people there, but no, right? Don't laugh, I'm serious. I mean, there are valuable people in AKP. There are people who have their minds at the right place, hearts at the right place. But, you know, people don't make economic decisions looking at a government and thinking about whether these are good people or not, right? What matters is the policy framework. We have none. That's a big problem, okay? So the international conjecture of things, the constellation of stars, really helped in the past few years. But that will end. It is actually coming to an end. This is why the Turkish markets are so shaken by this tapering talk, right? We actually understand full well that this is our umbilical cord, okay? And the sad thing here is, in 2007, when we were thinking about, you know, has the 2001 crisis and the response to that been a breaking point for the Turkish economy? Are we a new Turkish economy today? The answer seems to be no. That 2002, 2006 was the exception rather than the new rule. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to thank Refet very quickly for that extremely informative but also entertaining and well-delivered talk. Officially, we're over time. If you have any questions, we may be able to have 1 or 2 short questions. Those of you who need to leave for classes, please depart. So any questions from anyone for Refet? Okay, here.
What's the pocketing in the government expenditure in the raise, especially in 2008?
We don't quite know. It's a black box. So the question was about Toki, and the answer is we don't know, and it's terrible that we don't know.
Anyone else? We're getting a bit rowdy.
Yeah.
Okay, Refet can field questions. You can come and chat to him here in 5 minutes.
Teşekkür ederim. Sağ olun. Çok naziksiniz.
Yani hocam Osman.
Tebrikler.
Nasılsınız hanımefendiciğim? Sağ olun.